Hey everyone, this is Kim Ahern. I'm sorry, I just heard a unmute comment, so I'm just making sure that you heard that. So if you missed that again, my name is Kim Ahern. I work for Governor Raimondo. I wanted to briefly start this call and thank the Governor for her leadership throughout this COVID response, and in particular to thank both directors that are on this call, Director Coyne-Fague from DOC and Dr. Alexander Scott from Department of Health. Thank you both for being here and for helping to organize this call to speak to you all today. And before I turn it over to Director Coyne-Fague, I wanted to give a brief update to the agenda that in the DOC portion that we've also been joined by the chairperson of the Parole Board, Laura Pizzatoro. She will also be able to speak to some of the parole issues that are coming up. So with that, I'll turn it over to Director Coyne-Fague.
Hi, Director. If you could just press *6 to unmute yourself, you may still be on mute.
See, it took me 2 tries. Sorry about that. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Great. So, hi, everyone on the call. Thanks for joining. For those of you that I don't know, my name is Trish Coyne-Fague. I am the Director of the Rhode Island Department of Corrections. And so what I thought I would do today is give you an update of what we have been doing at Corrections to both prepare for and respond to the crisis with COVID-19, as well as, in particular, some aspects of inmate life that have changed and how we're responding in that context. And then what I would do is I will ask our medical director, Dr. Jennifer Clark, to give an update on those things as they relate to our healthcare response. And then I'll ask Chairperson Laura Pizzatoro to talk about parole initiatives. So at the Department of Corrections, I'm happy to see that our population has actually been dropping a little bit. And why I think that's happening, I'll touch on that. But we generally have in between 25 and 2,600 inmates right now in custody. What we have been doing up to now, I have a team at the executive level that meets 3 times a week, and frankly, usually more as needed. We participate in calls, regular calls with REMA. We convened a meeting with court representatives, the AG, the public defender, police chiefs association, the sheriff, and the state police to talk about various issues related to inmate management, commitments, transport, and court hearings, as well as ways to reduce our census, which I'll touch on in a moment. And that group is now part of a group that regularly has calls with emergency management as well. So they've been kind of brought into the fold. I send a daily email to all staff. Wardens are keeping inmates informed verbally and through newsletters, and I also just sent a separate written update to all facilities specifically for inmates in an attempt to answer some frequently asked questions. We've, at the Department of Corrections, we practice for emergencies, and believe it or not, a couple of years ago we had a department-wide drill, and the drill was on a pandemic. So we already had some things in place that we could turn to as a basis for preparing for this emergency, which is, of course, really unprecedented. We've all taken refresher training on various incident command systems, radio communications, and the like. We have partially activated part of incident command with the appointment of a logistics chief who works with another person in our planning and research unit, particularly on supply issues. Supply inventory, procurement, and distribution, especially those things that are short right now, like PPE, personal protective equipment. But we have a dedicated staff that's all they work on all day, every day, is making sure that we have the supplies we need to address this crisis. We have got liaisons with the National Guard for both operations and medical that we are dealing with, that we talk to and have toured each facility with, so that they will be up to speed should we need to lean on the National Guard for any sort of staffing assistance or medical assistance or resource assistance. Early on, we placed signage in all of our buildings warning people of the symptoms, encouraging them to wash their hands, and so forth. And those signs are bilingual, English and Spanish. We have a team of investigators that monitor inmate climate every single day. They are kind of taking the temperature throughout the facilities to make sure everyone is calm and that questions are answered and that people are getting the help they need. Mental health staff certainly are continuing to monitor inmates for any signs of distress or anxiety related to this. The reports that I get back is that the population is calm and seems to be appreciative of the efforts that they're seeing, and they know that disruptions to their regular routine are in the interest of keeping everyone safe and healthy. We are exploring the possibility of inmates actually making surgical masks in our correctional industries. All staff with inmate contact are now wearing masks because they're the ones that move in and out of the facility, and so the masks are really to protect the inmates from getting the virus. All home visits with probationers, parolees, and home confinees have been suspended for the time being. We are really trying to do as much in terms of technology as we can, phone visits, we're doing video, conferencing where we can. Any staff able to work from home has been encouraged to do so. We are trying to separate people from each other as much as we can and creating as much spatial separation as we can. To that end, the movement of inmates between facilities has stopped. So everyone is where they were a week ago. People are not being moved from one facility to another. The URI pharmacy program has committed to making us some hand sanitizer because, as everyone else, we're very low on that. So we're very appreciative of that. We have a new process for new commitments. New commitments are asked the screening questions for the virus. They're evaluated for symptoms. We have communicated with law enforcement about this, and they understand if they have someone who's symptomatic that we'll probably conduct that screening outside in the police car before the person ever comes in to try to keep people who might be sick from coming into the facility if we can. All transport vehicles are regularly being decontaminated, and staff shift supervisors are screening staff at the beginning of every roll call. So any staff that has symptoms or has traveled, and we are making sure that we're staying on top of that. In terms of inmate life, all incoming commitments are being quarantined for 14 days. We suspended visits and we suspended programs. We suspended anyone but medical or mental health staff coming in and out of the facilities, and of course correctional officers, trying to alleviate as much potential for transmission into the facility as we possibly can. With the suspension of programs, all providers were directed to provide a written plan on how they could provide program information to inmates remotely. We don't want inmates to lose the opportunity to gain program participation time off sentence if at all possible. And so some of those providers have come up with ways to continue their program even while they're not coming in to personally provide that program. Inmates who can no longer work their prison jobs, people who work on like litter crews, they're still going to be paid their inmate wages, and they're still going to receive 2 days a month industrial time off their sentence. Work release inmates are no longer working, but they're still going to receive their 2 days of industrial time off sentence per month. We've increased the dollar amount limit for inmate commissary orders for inmates. I know that as I shored up my emergency food supply at home. I bought a box of brownies because I don't usually buy brownies, but when I'm feeling stressed, it makes me feel better. And so we kind of thought maybe allowing inmates to buy a little bit more than they're normally allowed to buy and keep in their cell might help people with their anxiety or make them feel a little better. It's a small thing. We thought it was a good thing to do. All inmates are now provided the ability to send 5 letters per week out free of charge. Inmate medication lines are being reconfigured. I'll let Dr. Clark talk about that, but we're looking at ways to keep people distant from each other as we can. As I said, we're working with the public defender in the courts on increasing the use of video court, as well as providing an ability for attorneys to visit their clients at the ACI via video. I was on a call at 8:30 this morning with all the chief judges of the court and the governor's office, and they are committed to trying to find different ways to make sure that the hearings happen and inmates can visit with their attorneys without anybody's health being at risk. We have postponed all non-emergent outside medical appointments. I'll let Dr. Clark talk about that. Inmates are provided the opportunity to use phones, even though a lot of their movement has been modified. They're let out a few at a time, so they're not all stacked up on that phone bank together so that they can have some separation between each other to keep each other safe. We have worked with the inmate phone vendor, and they have agreed to provide 2 free phone calls a week for each inmate. Inmates are permitted out for showers and recreation. The social distancing is still being enforced in recreation. They are reminded throughout the day to wash their hands. Soap is provided to inmates free of charge. We have modified the dining schedule, so while the inmates are being fed in their mod for 2 meals a day, they do go to the dining room for at least 1 meal a day, and that's so they can get at least 1 hot meal a day. Masks are being worn by inmate kitchen workers and cleaning crews, and we have moved minimum security females back to the Bernadette building where they had been moved out of a couple of years ago to provide some more space. So just briefly, I know I'm almost out of time, I'm going to talk about sentence reduction. We are providing a list on a weekly basis to the public defender and the AG, and I discussed it with the courts this morning, of inmates who are being held on low bail. And I really encourage the court to not hold people on low bail at this point. And the public defenders are filing motions to reduce bail for people who are here because they don't have a couple $100 to try to get them out. We're also reviewing lists of inmates who have short, maybe 4 years or less to go in their sentence, to see if they've previously lost any good time, to see if that good time could be restored to them, so that can accelerate their release date. And I've also encouraged the courts to increase their utilization of home confinement for awaiting trial defendants and sentencing where appropriate. This morning I asked my planning unit for a list of inmates who might be eligible for possible classification to home confinement. We've done that review in the past. It's usually an extraordinarily low number, like single digits, but I want to look at it anyway. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer Clark to talk about what we're doing from healthcare. I know that the CDC came out with some guidance this morning, and I was very pleased to read it because we are doing just about all of it. Jennifer?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
You can. Okay, great. Thank you. I think the director touched on most of what we're doing on the medical side. We've been working very closely with the Department of Health, and I really appreciate all of their input. And the plan we have in place is sort of a combination of what nursing homes are doing and what community providers, what's been recommended for community providers. So we're really, we've limited the movement of people between facilities and stuff, but even between housing units. And I've tried to keep people in very small groups so that even if the virus were to come into the facility, we would be able to contain it quickly. We have, for now, limited medical appointments to urgencies and emergencies, but we are quickly looking at how we can maintain regular medical services, so people are still getting all their medications, but general follow-up for high blood pressure. We're working on a system to do that with limited contact, so using telemedicine as much as possible. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you, Director.
Thank you. This is Dr. Alexander Scott. I am honored to add on to what my beloved colleagues from the Department of Corrections have shared. We are working very closely together and have the same goal of keeping, the correctional system healthy and safe as they are functioning. As noted, we have met with the judges this morning because we know it is an overall partnership on being able to be as aggressive as we can be to prevent against any unwanted scenarios occurring. And, I stand with Department of Corrections, who has done everything they can and are continuing to assess further, as you've been hearing, on being able to protect our population. So I want to stop there and be able to see what's next, or any questions.
We're going to open it up to questions for everyone.
I think, could we please go to Laura Pizzataro first?
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, that was my fault. I'd like to hear from Laura Pizzataro about what she's doing with parole, please. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Director. This is Laura Pizzataro, everyone, Chairperson of the Parole Board. Thanks, and I'm happy to be on the call. I know it goes without saying that this poses a lot of questions and challenges for us at the Parole Board and parole supervision. And so what I've been doing on behalf of the board, and we'll be meeting with the board later this week, is to look at how do we balance the statutory and due process rights of inmates on the inside and also protect our role in considering public safety and safe release, and also make sure we're keeping in mind our parolees who are existing in the community on parole supervision. As I want to make sure everybody on the call knows, the board has authority to consider early release and set conditions for the time that someone is in the community on parole. It's statutory, it is somewhat limited, and then it's the Department of Corrections that has authority over parole supervision. So, for every parole decision that we make, we need to consider whether needed services would be available to someone if he or she is released in the community. And the landscape changes quickly under this crisis, and so that assessment changes with it. Bearing that in mind, specifically, I have been reviewing the number of parole violators that we have on the inside that the board has not yet seen, who may have certain rights attached to them because they're in violation status. We've identified only 2 at this point, and I've made decisions to rescind one of those warrants to allow the person to be released into the community. They can have a hearing at a later date before the board in the community. We're looking at persons already granted parole, but with a delayed release date between now and December. We've identified about 53 of those persons. For one reason or another, the person may have to complete a program. We may be waiting for them to get set up on the outside. And so we're going to take another look at those cases to see if any of those contingencies or conditions can be modified in light of the current crisis. Again, provided we can, we have some assurances of safe release, etc. We're also looking at persons scheduled for reconsideration. So these are people who have not been granted parole, but they simply have hearings scheduled. So we're going to be looking at that list to determine whether or not we should move any of those hearings up, perhaps for our lower risk offenders. Can we move those hearings up so that the board can hear them earlier and therefore make decisions earlier? Some of these decisions by law have to go before the board, and the board is very much interested in making itself available so that we can get these meetings scheduled. The board will be meeting this week, tentatively Thursday afternoon, for an open meeting, and we expect to make that available via teleconference to the public to address these issues as well as any other adjustments in our practices that we have to make. Happy to answer any questions as well.
Hi, this is Amy Ferguson from the Rhode Island Coalition for the Homeless. Thanks so much for providing us with this information and opportunity to hear what you guys are doing. One of the concerns that we have from the homeless service provider world is for the folks that are being discharged abruptly, but we understand the thought process of wanting to get people out. What discharge planning is happening? Because we've run into at least one occasion where someone was just released with nothing and they wound up in our homeless system, which felt very unfair.
This is Trish. I can talk about that.
Madam Director, if I may, just from the parole perspective, keep in mind, no one's getting released to parole unless they have a home plan. The parole board does not release to homeless shelters, so that's where this is not the category that that your question addresses. So I'll defer to Trish.
Thank you. We have removed a lot of, program people from the facilities, but we are still working with discharge planning. We actually just had a discussion about this yesterday afternoon with some rehab services staff. And so discharge planning, and certainly for high-risk populations, is something that's still a huge priority for us. Keeping in mind that not everyone takes discharge planning, not everyone wants discharge planning, and it's a particular challenge for us, and always has been a challenge for us with our awaiting trial population, because they come in and out more quickly, and we don't always have the resources to do any, it's hard to do meaningful discharge planning with an awaiting trial population. I suspect that might be the situation with the person you referenced, but if you want to reach out to me separately, send me an email if you have more details on that, and I'd be happy to look into it for you.
Sure. What is your email?
Sure. It's Patricia, Patricia, Coyne-Fague, all one word, Coyne, as in Frank, AGUE, at doc.ri.gov.
Awesome. Thank you so very much. I appreciate it.
Sure.
I'd like to ask a question if I could. My name is Chris Radcliffe from the Community College of Rhode Island. My question has to do with student access to the tools they need to complete their work this semester. We specifically have 19 men in an entrepreneurship program. They're scheduled to graduate in December, and each of them has a computer, but it's in the classroom area. And my question is, how do we get them access to the computer so that we can send work to them and they can continue this semester and finish this semester, whether it's going into the classroom area or if they could be allowed to have them in their cells?
Sure. So we have been looking at each of the programs. As I said, I asked each program provider to get me a plan on how they could still continue to provide programming. Putting a group of inmates in a class, putting 19 men in a class together is, I think, probably not feasible right now, but I have spoken to my Assistant Director for Rehab Services, who is working with his staff to evaluate what ways we can continue delivering programs or delivering study methods to inmates so they don't lose out not only on the programming time, but on the program itself. And certainly educational programs are a priority for us. So they won't have the ability to put computers in their cells, but to the extent that we can work on scheduling or staffing so that maybe we can split that group in half and they can use the computer room. Those are the kinds of questions that we've been asking, and that I'm expecting the rehab staff to give me a recommendation on.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, this is Natalia Friedlander from the Rhode Island Center for Justice. Pennsylvania announced yesterday that they're preparing to furlough inmates. Is that something that you've been discussing internally?
We've been looking at furloughs before COVID was a thing. We were looking at, reinvigorating our furlough system, because way back before I came to corrections over 20 years ago, there was, inmates went out on furlough for social, and I don't mean like to go to a party, but I mean like to, reconnect with their family and establish themselves preparing for release. And that kind of went by the wayside. At one point in time, something bad happened, so it kind of came to a screeching halt. And we've been talking in the last year or so about ways that we can reinvigorate that program. The way the statute reads now is certainly people can be sent out for various reasons for a maximum of 14 days, no more than I think one 14-day period in a 6-month period. I don't right now see the value in sending any inmate out under these circumstances only to bring them back in 14 days. And also the inmates that will currently be eligible for that kind of furlough anyway would generally be minimum security inmates who are frankly low risk and close to release anyway. And so given my current staffing challenges, and I don't currently see the value in that as much as I see the value in having courts release people who are, for example, held on low bail and so forth. A lot of the initiatives that you see in other states, as you know, are at the behest of courts. My ability to simply let people out of the ACI is extraordinarily limited.
Hi, Tanya Harris, Director for the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Thank you so much all for the time for allowing for this call today. We do much of our work, actually all of our work, through the lens of the domestic violence for a victim and through anti-racism and with an anti-racism and oppression lens. So we understand and support much of what's being talked about today. A question that we had, or maybe just something to consider, would be during the pre-trial phase, and that those particular types of offenders and those that are violent, not the nonviolent ones where it's lethality, where there might be domestic violence involving strangulation or repeat offenders, consideration being that they would remain held because of the violent nature of the act.
I have to confess, I missed the beginning of your question. You were breaking up, at least on my phone.
Sure, no problem. Just a consideration that those who are in pretrial and being held, that are the violent offenses, such as repeat offenders or strangulation, those lethality risk factors. And understanding, of course, the need, as has been discussed already, for non-violent offenders possibly being released. Just consideration for those that are violent to be held.
Yeah, and certainly I would expect that, first of all, violent offenders normally held on higher bail. A lot of the low bail people we're seeing are people that owe like fines. But certainly the violence of the accusation for which an inmate would be held would be something a court would definitely consider. And I know that the Attorney General's office or law enforcement prosecuting that case would be a real advocate for the victim in those kinds of cases. I would not anticipate the courts rushing to release people charged with violent offenses.
Hi, this is Tal Frieden. I'm asking on behalf of a coalition of over 25 community groups that are concerned about the responses in the criminal justice system. And specifically, we were wondering what the plan was, if any, to release immunocompromised, elderly, and particularly vulnerable populations, similar to the actions that have been taken in Washington, Texas, and in New York City.
Sure. So I looked at the links that you referenced, And first of all, Rhode Island does have a system for providing medical parole for inmates who fall into certain categories of medical situations. I am completely without authority as director to simply release people who are immunocompromised or might be at risk because of COVID. I just don't have that legal authority. The links that you sent in Texas, in New York, in Ohio, in Sacramento, and so forth, those are judges releasing people. I know that North Dakota has had some action taken by their parole board, and that in Alabama the prison is not taking new commitments from county jails. Rhode Island is a unified system. Our county jail is intake, so it's all us. So I can't refuse to take anyone, and I can't just decide to release anyone. To the extent that there's someone who might meet the eligibility for medical parole, that's when it becomes a conversation between our medical division and the parole board.
Hi, my name is Sophie. Hi, my name is Sophie, and I'm part of the same coalition that Tal just mentioned, and also works specifically with Black and Pink. And I just wanted to follow